So I don't know if you guys saw it, but there was an Ahsoka series recently, and it's fair to say that I wasn't a huge fan. In fact, despite it not being widely considered a terrible series, it might be one of my least favourite Star Wars things of all time, and I'd like to dive into why. It's difficult to know exactly where to start because there were a few key problems with this show that I thought really held it back. To give it some credit, Ahsoka separates itself from the Jon Favreau penned Mandoverse entries by actually being about its characters. The issue is that this then puts some of my problems with characterization a little more front and center. I was never on board with Jedi Sabine as a concept, not because it's woke or because she doesn't deserve it, just because I was never really sold on the fact she needed it. A bit like Rey Skywalker, I suppose. There is something to be said about exploring the fact that the Force is accessible to anyone who taps into it, but at the same time, turning a competently badass Mandalorian into a bad Jedi feels like a strange thing to do, because she was already pretty useful, and it never seemed like something she wanted to be in either show. But that's not really even the stuff about this version of Sabine that sticks out to me. In fact, I kind of forgot about it every week until the show reminded me. My main takeaway about her is just how frustratingly closed off she is emotionally. This is no comment on the casting, it seems like a very conscious thing, but her abrasiveness makes her quite inaccessible and pretty unrecognizable. She was always spunky, but in a way that was kinda cool and fun rather than sulky and mean. Hera, or Hera, comes a lot closer to her animated counterpart in the way she's written and performed, but maybe she's just easier to get right. Despite that, I felt like her role in the story kept her out of the action in a way that really didn't do her justice. I'm not sure how I feel about the mum of the group being left behind to deal with repetitive bureaucracy while everyone else gets to have an adventure, especially when she's fully tossed aside for the finale, because we gotta have more time for Grand Admiral Thrawn. Let's talk about him. Ooh, isn't he so scary? Lars Mikkelsen is really cool in the role. Sure, there's stuff about his motivation that seems completely at odds with the backstory they've established across the new canon, but I suppose if they need a generic Long Live the Empire style guy to lead the Imperial Remnant in this conflict, they could definitely do far worse. Far, far worse.
The Force.
It would be nice though if Dave Filoni figured out how to write an intelligent villain. It's fun and threatening to have an antagonist who's always one step ahead, but I think to really achieve the full effect of that, we need to see it. It's not quite enough for him to go, "Not to worry, Morgan Elsbeth. Whatever she does, we will be one step ahead." Like, what does that mean? How? He just feels like a dumb guy's idea of a genius, and he looks like one too. And I do wish he had a bit more of a connection with Ahsoka. Oh yeah, Ahsoka is in this. Now she's someone I've always been a fan of. I grew up with her on the Clone Wars and adored seeing her all grown up in Rebels, but I think she's always been a strange choice to lead a Rebels continuation. She was such a small part of that series that her relationships with most of these characters require a lot of imagination. Like when she reunites with Ezra in this show, there's not really anything meaningful for them to say to one another. She feels at her best here when she sort of takes on the Ben Kenobi role in Sabine and Ezra's story. She works decently well as a static dispenser of wisdom as the kids do their adventure, but unfortunately that's practically never the part she plays. For 90% of the series we have to follow the story as if it's hers, when frankly she doesn't have a huge amount to do with it, nor does she feel like talking about how she does fit in, or talking about much at all. Since we first saw the character in live action, I've found her incredibly cold in her stoicism. The warmth and kindness is gone, and what's left is quite a boring mouthpiece of Jedi dogma. But whenever I or anyone else voiced an opinion on how this didn't feel like Ahsoka, they were shouted down. Everyone, including Filoni in promotional material, said that this was Ahsoka brought to life, straight from the cartoons, that Rosario Dawson was capturing every aspect of the character. But then along came this show, where Ahsoka went through some spiritual healing and became nice again. And then these people started to say, see, her awful vibes were always deliberate, which I found curious because I'd been led to believe that there were no such vibes. Her transformation showed that this aloof characterization was fully deliberate, but that made it no less frustrating. We had to spend 6 episodes with an unpleasant shell of a character we once loved, but with no context for this new persona. She's meant to be our protagonist, and we're not let into her emotional state enough to know whether she's been woefully miscast, or poorly directed, or if it's part of the narrative. Like, okay, she's intentionally this way, but why? And why should we care? That brings me to a wider point about this show's approach to storytelling, or I suppose its aversion to storytelling. There's so much going on this season that is never spoken about plainly or at all, and I promise that's not just me being incapable of detecting subtlety in subtext, because whenever the show does want to say something, it's hilariously on the nose about it. So when the rest of the script is made up of nothing but half-hearted gesturing towards emotions, motivations, and personal histories, it really feels like a failing, and one that makes it so hard to give a shit about anything. Sabine and Ezra have been separated for over a decade, and talk about nothing when they reunite. She dodges all his big questions, and the answers he does get are either given given off-screen or from Huyang. It's even worse with Sabine and Ahsoka, supposedly the central dynamic of the whole series. Unseen events from their past inform exactly where their relationship is at the start of the show, and the rocky status of their relationship drives so much of the show's plot. So why is it that we had to spend the majority of the series hearing nothing but the flimsiest hints towards what went down? Sabine is closed off emotionally, Ahsoka is closed off emotionally, not just to each other, but to everyone, and to us, the audience. Who the hell are we supposed to identify with here? How are we even meant to know what's going on? With Baylan and Shin, the two secondary antagonists, it's pretty much the exact same story. We're kept at arm's length from them the whole time, never learning much about what their deal is. I'm sure it's meant to come off as mysterious and therefore interesting, but my god does it wear thin. Baylan spouts a bunch of platitudes that suggest depth, reminiscing about the strengths and flaws of the Jedi Order. Shin maybe has a moment of conflict. They're both practically begging for a chance to be explored fully, but it never comes. When it comes to the finale, they're also just tossed to one side. It's baffling how willingly this show abandons and sidelines the ideas it spent the whole season teasing and alluding to with insufferable vagueness. And I know this story's not over, but it doesn't come across like things are being left unresolved for the sake of an ongoing narrative. It's more like this sense that suddenly none of it really matters. Oh, speaking of something that doesn't matter, and this is really going to upset people, let's talk about Anakin Skywalker. Whenever the prospect of Hayden returning to play Anakin as a Force ghost was discussed, I thought it would be great. Conversations with dead people in Star Wars have always been wonderful moments of reconnection, guidance, and emotion. Unfortunately, when they put Anakin in this series, they kind of forgot to include any of these, even just the conversation part. We get half an episode of Clone Wars flashbacks and World Between Worlds dueling, and then Ahsoka comes away with a new sense of healing and closure. But I can't for the life of me figure out why. I can't pin down what she's supposed to have learned or gained from this. Anakin said some generic, very non-specific Jedi Master lessons to her, and then they had a bit of a fight. The show is pretending that something profound happened, but what did they actually talk about? This is Hayden's first appearance as Anakin post-Vader, and that's a real opportunity. I saw someone on Twitter say that no two characters have ever had more to talk about than him and Ahsoka, but to say that the surface was merely scratched feels like I'm devaluing the concept of scratching. I've seen loads of people say, you're being deliberately obtuse if you're pretending this isn't clear. The meaning of the sequence is obvious, and then they all say something completely different. The last time Ahsoka gained closure through fighting Vader, before her transformation was unwritten and redone for live action, it came after a whole season of her anguish for the fate of her master. This time, we don't really know what she overcame because we don't know what she was going through beforehand. The lesson is, it's pretty impossible to get an understanding of a change when the character's mental state is such a mystery to us. It means the entire Anakin side of this story ends up feeling completely superfluous to the overall narrative. There are so many more examples of this inability to actually discuss things because it's the whole show. No one says anything. It's like the Rise of Skywalker, Finn has to tell Rey something but never says it shenanigans, but with every character and every relationship. Vital details for multiple character arcs are inexplicably turned into mystery boxes. I feel like I've been perpetually gaslit by people who've said, well, of course this hasn't happened yet, they've got to save something for the finale. You don't expect them to launch straight into meaningful conversation. They've just reunited. Give it time. Baylan's not going to give away his whole deal straight away. There's still X number of episodes left. And then the finale came and delivered none of these things, and people said, well, we never needed more depth, and I don't know who said we'd ever get it. You can justify the emotional caginess with as many plot reasons as you want. It doesn't make it any easier to find a reason to care about these people or their stories, especially when you get the impression that they don't care much about what's going on either. I think part of the reason it's so hard to enter the story at this point as a viewer is that no one is doing it as a character. I've spoken recently about the role of the companion in Doctor Who, the outsider who enters the sci-fi world and reacts as we would. Obviously, a Star Wars show is slightly different, but to a certain extent it's something that every story needs. From our perspective as an audience, so much in this world and in the lives of our heroes has been newly introduced or changed, but no one is responding to that change. Everyone is taking it in their stride because it's not all new to them, only to us. We have no entry point. It places these huge barriers around practically every character because they have no reason to explain anything to anyone. They're all on the same page, it's just that we're not there with them. We don't necessarily need a character to stand around asking stupid questions, but it can't be overstated just how valuable it is to enter a story through the eyes of a character who's also entering into that situation. It's something that Star Wars has pretty much always understood. That's why we have Ahsoka in the Clone Wars, Ezra in Rebels, Kaz in Resistance, Omega in the Bad Batch, Cassian in Andor, or how about Luke Skywalker in a little film called Star Wars? If we just rocked up to the Colossus or the Bad Batch or Narkina 5 prison, and it was just the status quo with no need for anyone to open up or reveal anything about themselves as a response to a change, the situation and the characters involved would be so much harder to engage with. We spend nearly the entirety of Ahsoka not knowing what went on between the two main characters that led to the events of this series. I bring this up again because it really feels like it's meant to be the foundation for the entire central relationship and storyline. We see the tension play out for 7 episodes with no context beyond the vaguest allusion to a fallout, which is frustrating and alienating. And by the time we do find out what went down, it's arguably way too late to matter because it's already been resolved. It's not even that it's some big huge secret, it's just that no one asks because they don't need to. Ahsoka, Sabine, Hera, Huyang, Baylan, they all know about it. Everyone knows about it except us. What the fuck is the point of that? It might have been quite useful if they got to the guy who was out of the loop for a decade sooner than just the penultimate episode, so we can be caught up alongside him. Or maybe they could have given Jason Syndulla more to do. He's connected to the story, but not enough that he wouldn't be asking some of the same questions that we do. Just a few conversations where his mum explains some stuff to him would have made such a difference. Because as it stands, I feel staggeringly disconnected from everyone and everything in this story. You'd think that would cover it, but my last point is also pretty important. It's a problem with the show's very core, and a question that wouldn't leave my mind whenever I was watching it. Who the hell is this for? I've spoken to people who haven't seen Rebels that were a bit lost watching Ahsoka, and a lot of them made excuses for the show, saying, well, I'm not sure what's going on, but it's clearly not for me. Yet here I am, as a Rebels fan, alongside many friends who are the same, and we kind of feel like it's not really for us either. It's really hard to say this without sounding entitled, but maybe it should be? It's trapped by the constraints that come with simultaneously being a high-budget spin-off of Disney's flagship Star Wars series and a sequel to a Disney XD cartoon series. To put it bluntly, I don't think it should exist. At least not like this. And that's not my way of saying it's objectively a cinematic failure or whatever, or that no one likes it, because I know there are people who do. But to me, it just feels so incredibly confused about its own identity. As a Rebels fan, I felt it wasted so much time retreading the events of that series to try and catch people up on where they needed to be. No real new information is learned for like the first 4 episodes. If they hadn't been so conscious about setting the scene, I think we probably could have gone to the new galaxy way earlier than the 6th episode, because that's when everyone stopped standing around glaring and things started being interesting for me. Also, for the most part, the change from animation to live action has done more to alienate me as a Rebels fan than thrill me at the idea of these stories and characters becoming real and finally having worth. I look at these people and I just don't see their animated counterparts. With Ahsoka herself, it's never happened. That's just a different lady. Sabine and Hera both kind of phase in and out of resemblance to their original versions, but they mostly feel like different people. They're working at a disadvantage given how much work the voice and vocal performance has to do to establish a character in an animated series, and how closely linked someone's voice is to the memories and associations that we have with them. Filoni spoke about how it would be impossible to replace Thrawn's iconic voice, but apparently that doesn't extend to anyone else. It is possible for someone to capture the vibe and personality of a character they didn't originate, but these recasts simply didn't. The exception being Iman Esfandi as Ezra. He's pure perfection, but clearly that kind of find is 1 in a million. So building a whole show around the slim chance that a fully recast group in a fully new medium is able to successfully recapture the vibes of a family of characters from an animated series is a ridiculous thing to do, especially when an animated continuation was very much on the cards. The rumour is that an animated series was being worked on, but it was cancelled when Filoni realised he could do it for real with this show. And I don't know if it's true, but it breaks my heart to see that animation is considered enough of a lesser medium for all of these compromises to be worth making. It's hilarious to me that they've desperately clung on to animated accuracy for eye colour and nothing else. The depth that eyes can provide to a performance is all lost here, obscured by the absolutely abysmal contact lenses. Every time I complained on Twitter about the eyes in this show, I was told that it was a nitpick, but come on. Distracting fluorescent contact lenses are not the proverbial window to the soul. It's a fascinatingly bad choice that serves no one, and I imagine it kind of irritates the eyes after a while as well. Oh yeah, if this was a show for Rebels fans, where's Zeb? Don't tell me they accidentally used him in the wrong show. It's like Hera went to a New Republic pilot bar to get help from an old friend and came out with Carson Tava. I wonder if Zeb was ever originally going to have that Carson role, but he was deemed too expensive. One of the core members of the Ghost crew would have a much more compelling reason to be there than some New Republic pilot. Hell, he'd have a much more compelling reason to be there than Ahsoka Tano. But okay, maybe it's not fair for us Rebels fans to expect to be catered to. We have to think of the new viewers. So okay, let's think about it from their perspective. You start the new Star Wars show and you're thrown right in the middle of an ongoing quest involving 3 characters you don't really know looking for another guy you don't really know, all while trying to prevent another guy you don't know from returning. The show is spending half its time dumping exposition on you about a show you haven't watched, and half the time vaguely hinting towards a load of unseen developments in their lives and relationships. And you have no way of discerning which information is new to you and which information is new to everyone. I'm sure there was a huge portion of people going, wow, I wish I knew more about Ahsoka and Sabine's training, but I suppose that's on me for not watching Rebels, when these 2 characters never had a single conversation in that show. While the pace of Ahsoka slowly plods along for the sake of not leaving anyone behind, there's very little to convince a new viewer why they should care about anything. An animated follow-up to the animated series could have been great. A widely accessible live-action spin-off of The Mandalorian that explores the rising Imperial Remnant conflict could have been great. But this feels like a very poorly executed attempt to be both, that fails to convincingly achieve being either. It's a show for no one that does nothing. This sounds so harsh, and I'd like to reiterate that I tried to give each of these episodes a fair shot, and there was some stuff I liked. There's even a whole episode I liked. I thought Shin Hati had a cool vibe, and I think it's a good thing for Star Wars to have a show led by so many female characters. Its existence is a sign of progress, but its novelty is a sign of how much more needs to be done. I think Chopper is wonderful. He felt like Chopper. C-3PO never fails to put a smile on my face. I thought that was a lovely way of including Leia in the story without using any digital necromancy. Check out my video on CGI faces. What else? I've always liked space whales, and the Noti, the little turtle men, are incredible. What an amazing slice of Star Wars. Doctor Who is funny in this show. He brings some life to some scenes that really need it. You really feel the size and scale of the Star Destroyer and the hyperspace ring, both in the atmosphere and in space. Iman Esfandi lights up every scene he's in as Ezra. Sabine choosing to go with Baylan was pretty good. It's nice when a character is forced to make a decision that tells us something about them. It's mostly nice because it's rare in these shows, but it's still nice. But even when there's an aspect that's good, or even great, it tends to be held back by something. Whether it's one of the reasons I've said before, something I've forgotten, or maybe just the bland direction that fails to bring some already lifeless scripts to life. Not all the direction is bad. Jennifer Getzinger especially was able to contribute a little bit of juice to a show that desperately needed it, so it's even more depressing that the worst director of them all is the one being handed control over the climactic Mandoverse movie, probably the only untitled Star Wars movie that'll actually be released. So much in this show just feels really flat. The action feels quite sluggish and awkward in its often very static framing, and when it does speed up you really get the sense that they're just acting out the steps that they've memorized. The volume feels smaller and more omnipresent than ever. The many circular rooms and spaces just make it impossible to believe that the characters are standing anywhere at all. Moments that we've been waiting for years are let down by an absence of any kind of spark, and you get the sense that it was made with a palpable fear of intimacy. We get to the end of the show and ask, what was the point of any of this? What's the show saying? It kind of says we have to move on, but from what? The past that wasn't important enough to clue us in on? The emotions that no one bothered expressing? The show that this could have been? I know it's not the end of the story, but I'm struggling to think of a time I've been less thematically or emotionally satisfied by a Star Wars, not including that one time. Ahsoka doesn't feel cohesive. Sometimes it doesn't even feel coherent. Despite the sacrifices that have been made to turn these cartoons into real life, not a single relationship feels realised or human. The culmination of all these problems is something so deeply frustrating, unfulfilling, and hollow. I'm not baffled by sheer hilarious incompetence, I'm just bored. Left cold by a consistently bland mush. And in my eyes, that's the worst thing a Star Wars show can be. I know not everyone agrees with me here, and I really don't mind if you don't. I'd love to hear in the comments what you think about this show, what makes you love it, what holds it back for you. Please let me know. I'll be nice to you if you're nice to me. Please be nice to me. I'm sorry if this has all been a bit negative. I just enjoy discussing and unpacking why something worked or why it didn't, especially when it's part of a series I love like Star Wars. Next time I like one of these shows, you'll get a video about it, I promise. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe if you'd be interested in seeing me talk about more things. I've been away from the channel for a while, so I'd appreciate people sharing this video with anyone they think might like it. It'll really help me out as the algorithm gets a bit more used to me. I think that's everything. Goodbye until next time. Love you lots.